I know that many of you in the audience dedicate a lot of your time to thinking about the UN system, and many of you to actually working directly with it. And I think probably the debate today may be less about how much Britain is willing to commit to this system, such a set of reforms, and more how we get the rest of the world to buy into this, because there is a deep reform fatigue of international institutions in much of the world, a weariness with the United Nations, I'm afraid to say, but also with the World Bank and the IMF as well. And I think there are a number of reasons for this, none of them new to you. First, many countries just simply feel unrepresented or underrepresented. The UN doesn't reflect their foreign policy preferences and priorities, and nor does it enable these always to become a reality. And it's not just the poorest countries, and nor is it just the most powerful, although these are the two groups that we usually think of as being frustrated for the UN. Rather, for a whole range of states across all kinds of levels of economic development, the global infrastructure often feels distant and irrelevant, and minus a sense of committed ownership from all countries, it's hard to move things forward. Too many countries feel bored by UN reform and use it just to score political points, and above all, use it to resist further empowering the UN's inner sanctum, the P5. Now, second, many countries believe that international institutions put their own national sovereignty under threat. The definition of sovereignty as full and exclusive control over territorially bounded issues remains a stubborn principle for many. For many countries, this narrowly defined sense of sovereignty came first. And, even when the US Republican presidential candidate, John McCain, was here last week, it was great to hear him speak of a renewed commitment to multilateralism. But when you actually saw what he was saying, read what he was saying, he had in mind multilateralism built around a league of like-minded democracies, an alternative to the one country, one vote stasis of the UN, where authoritarian governments enjoy the same voting power as democracies, which in the eyes of him and others reduces its effectiveness enormously. And of course, third, many countries accuse the UN of being ineffective and wasteful too. They highlight the visible weakness of the UN in testing grounds such as Darfur. It's too slow to act or fails to act at all. Management of operations remain poor. They change too often, etc. And so while the good of the UN remains less than self-evident to many of the world's governments and peoples, our key challenge is to convince them that the UN can be strengthened, and that that's what's in their best interest, and that doing so is imperative if we are to tackle the global challenges of a global age. We need institutions that, in the face of global challenges, produce outputs greater than the sum of their parts. We need a rules-based international system that accelerates contributions and deals effectively with those who work, if you like, against the grain and who seek to resist the will of the international community. And, as someone who's spent many years in it, I know it's not the easiest way to conduct international affairs, but, I think it's a little bit like what Winston Churchill had to say about democracy. Until you think about all the other ways. Once you've done that, you realize for all its faults, it's still the best. Well, how do we set about this reform of the UN? And part of it is, of course, indeed institutional reform. And a key reason why we've not yet won the argument is that the UN, as I say, is not always seen to be working for the benefit of all member states on these emerging global challenges. Prime Minister, in the two speeches I've mentioned, set out three top priorities for reform. First, reforming the international institutions, and particularly the World Bank, to be capable of tackling climate change as well as global poverty. Secondly, re-examining the roles of the IMF and World Bank to find new ways to handle global financial turbulence and to bring prosperity to to more than just a fortunate few. And third, reforming international institutions, the UN, particularly to offer more effectively counter terrorism, the spread of conflict, and state failure, while ensuring that issues such as energy and water and other areas which are not well covered at this point by the UN system are covered too, and that finally, post-conflict, that there is the capacity to tackle crises, but also to stabilize countries and start rebuilding their governance and institutions. From the UN's point of view, this means two urgent priorities for reform. One, reforming the UN Security Council to bring in nations from all four corners of the globe. You've heard, you know, of the G4, Japan, Germany, Brazil, and India, plus African representation. Now, permanent reform is still some way off. There's far from an agreement that can be acted on, and therefore there's increasing examination of intermediate solutions which might give longer membership, but still temporary membership to some countries, and a membership which could be renewed and which might be made permanent at a later stage. And it probably is going to be easier to move on some such basis as that. And while a larger council will be a more difficult council, and the points of view represented will be more diverse, and there'll be more passionate disagreements, and occasionally, I'm sure, there will be a frustration amongst its old members that the club's been ruined by the new members. Nevertheless, the hope is that by expanding it in these ways, we will overcome the charges of irrelevance made by those nations and regions that don't feel they currently have a stake in the Security Council system. Second, we have been working now for some time, from when I was at the UN and Gordon Brown as Chancellor was a member of a UN reform panel to look at system-wide coherence across the United Nations. We've been seeking to build on the November 2006 report, Delivering as One, the idea being to get the UN at the country level much more integrated and effective, with a lower overhead and more resources available for its development and humanitarian activities. And we're getting there, but very, very slowly across some pilots with a lot of political resistance from some governments, although I don't think it's very well-grounded resistance. But with $15 billion now of development assistance channeled through the UN, it really is important that this money be used effectively. For example, we have 23 separate agencies who claim to be working on water issues within the UN system, which doesn't, on the face of it, sound sensible given the crisis water is going to face. You want somebody responsible for addressing these issues in a much more clear way. So we've got to go on driving towards a one UN reform process.